Good evening. Welcome to the DeBaun Auditorium at Stevens Institute of Technology, the Innovation University. This building, Edwin A. Stevens Hall, constructed in 1870, is a registered landmark and was the Institute's first facility. Throughout this academic year, the university is marking the 140th anniversary of its founding by the Stevens family, America's first family of entrepreneurs. My name is Gregory Kramer. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Advancement. I thank you for joining us at this important and timely event entitled Fossil Fuels in the Year 2050, a thought leadership panel discussion about the future of energy. Discover magazine has partnered with Shell and Stevens in presenting this discussion. A number of people were instrumental in making this happen. First, from Discover magazine, Tricia Gately, Director of Marketing, and Suzanne Puchalsky, Advertising Director, provided critical leadership, planning, and execution throughout the process. Pam Rosen, Manager of Web, Social Media, and Support Services at Shell, coordinated the participation of our sponsor for this evening, Shell. The Stevens side of the production, as well as coordination with Discover, has been managed expertly by our Director of University Communications, Patrick Berzinski. He and his team have worked long and hard to ensure a successful culmination. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Corey S. Powell. Corey, editor-in-chief of Discover magazine, has been an editor for the publication for 12 years, has been published in newspapers and magazines across the country, and is the author of the book, God in the Equation. Corey?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming here tonight. This is a tremendous opportunity, I think, to address really one of the most important policy questions, one of the most important energy questions facing us right now, in a slightly different way than these questions are usually framed. I think there's in discussions of energy. As in so many hot-button policy issues, there's a tendency to kind of go to extremes. There are people who say, we can, there are no problems, we can maintain the status quo, everything's going to be fine. There are people who say we need radical change, we need to, overthrow the system. I think we all kind of know intuitively that the truth is somewhere in between, that there's going to be technological change, there's going to be a period of transition, that we need to find the people, the real expert opinions to actually guide us on how does that transition happen, what should the future roadmap look like. Well, we're very fortunate here to have 4 people who can really help map out what that transition is going to look like. We're very fortunate to have Stevens and Shell helping us to put together this group of people. So I'm not a big fan of giving sort of long, windy, potted introductions to people. I'm just going to introduce them quickly. They'll come out, and then as we start the panel discussion, I'll let them each introduce themselves, more specifically in the context of the research that they do. The first one, our first panelist this evening, Anthony Cugini. He is the director of the Office of Research and Development at the National Energy Technology Laboratory. What that means is basically he's doing research and development through an advanced technology lab. He shuttles between Pittsburgh, Morgantown, and Pennsylvania. We're lucky to have him here today. He will tell you more about exactly how it is that works. Next up, we have Turgay Erdogan. He has extensive experience in the development of fluid flow dynamics and porous media. He's taught in fluid dynamics. He served on the Society of the Petroleum Engineers editorial board. He has, well, I'll let him sort of decipher all the different research that he's worked on. But what we have here is a person who understands all the fluid dynamics processes, the porous media processes, who really understands the nuts and bolts of the media that we're dealing with here. Next, we're very fortunate to have Richard Sears, who is currently serving up at MIT, who has served also at Shell, who has expertise in alternate fuels and in fuel R&D. And again, I'll let him describe this in further detail. And Paul Winstanley, a relatively new addition to the life here at Stevens, as you'll notice from his accent. And he will talk a little bit about the research expertise that he brings and some of the efforts that he's doing in efforts for radical energy efficiency. So, first of all, I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel. I'd like to get the conversation going. Thank you all. Introduce yourselves a little bit in terms of your own research and kind of where you fall in this question of what the energy mix of the year 2050 is going to look like. Should we start, Anthony?
Okay. Well, as you said, I'm Anthony Cugini. I'm with the National Energy Technology Laboratory. It's one of the 17 DOE national laboratories devoted to energy. Our primary interest is in fossil energy, though we've lately taken on a lot of significant undertakings related to efficiency and renewable energy. Obviously, having a fossil energy focus, our laboratory has some key roles related to the future of fossil energy. So one of the major programs that we're leading today is carbon capture and sequestration. As we look to fossil energy into the future, it's obvious to us and I think to the country that carbon capture and sequestration will be an important part and facilitating technology, almost an enabling technology, to allow fossil energy to be part of that mix.
Wonderful. Turgay?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Turgay Artekin. I'm coming from Pennsylvania State University. The profession, I'm a petroleum engineer, and within the petroleum engineering in the upstream operations, I deal with reservoir modeling. So we try to develop some mathematical expressions to study fluid flow dynamics in porous media. And our goal is just to optimize the field development, maximize the recovery from a given field, and then also at the same time trying to leave the smallest footprint. So in order to bring all these things together, it takes a good degree of engineering judgment and experience that needs to be brought in. So we try. These are the things that I try to teach to my students.
Thank you. Paul.
Okay, thank you. As you can probably guess, I don't talk like this for a joke. Excuse me. I am British, and even though I'm British, I've spent a lot of time living and working in the United States over the last 5 or so years. I'm not a career academic, though I'm employed by Stevens Institute. What I actually bring to this is close on 25 years in industry, and one of the things that I've learned and I've seen most success from during my time in industry is really how you address problems from an holistic and systematic view. So what I'm actually interested in is how do we actually sustain the availability of fuel whilst we also continue to search for credible alternatives, and we also ameliorate environmental damage. One of my other areas of interest is really looking for technological supplies, and in doing some research for the panel tonight, one of the factors I found which absolutely staggered me was from my time in London. Whenever I walk around London these days, I trip over electric cars frequently. Those electric cars are manufactured in India, and I think there's a huge opportunity for technological surprise. Then finally, one of the points I would like to make, and I did emphasize I'm not a career academic, I do think there's a huge gap we're facing in terms of education and training and actually preparing the workforce for the energy transition which we've undoubtedly got to go through.
Okay, wonderful. Richard?
Okay, thank you. And good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Sears. I've had a long and very fun career with Shell. I started work with Shell Oil Company in 1976 as a geophysicist. And over the 33 years, I was involved in, participated in the discovery and development of hydrocarbon resources on and around 6 continents around the world, from onshore to very deep waters offshore, waters approaching 10,000 feet water depth. And that's how I spent most of my professional career. The last 3 years or so, while managing Shell research programs, I was also a visiting scientist at MIT, associated with the energy laboratory as well as computer science and electrical engineering departments. And retired from Shell at the end of May. I'm still at MIT, and my research interests are in broadly speaking energy systems, particularly the transition to the next energy systems. What's next? What could come next? And in this, I'm very concerned with the realities of energy as we use it today, and how that will dictate the future path. And if I could start that conversation, I'll just ground everybody with a few numbers. Numbers are dangerous, but they'll frame energy, because we're here to talk about hydrocarbons in the year 2050. Hydrocarbons conventionally means oil, natural gas, and coal. And right now, oil, natural gas, and coal represent about 80% of our primary energy supply in the world. And so it's a lot. It's a big fraction of what we use. And just so you get a sense that it's not just a large fraction, it's a lot in terms of its magnitude. In the hour that we're sitting here tonight, the world will go through about 1.5 million gallons of crude oil. The world will go through almost 1.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas and almost 2 billion pounds of coal. That's how much energy the world will use while we sit here for this hour talking about the future of hydrocarbon energy. And that's an important place to start the discussion, because anything that we talk about moving to in 2050 is going to have to replace energy use at that scale.
Well, I mean, that naturally sets up the first thing I wanted to ask, someone as a devil's advocate position. Can you imagine that in the world of 2050 that fossil fuels would not be a significant part of the energy mix? Is that conceivable?
My answer is I don't see it as realistic to believe it won't be. I think Shell does a lot of work on scenarios. Shell's most recent scenario work, using very aggressive growth rates for renewables, suggests not 80% in 2050 for hydrocarbons, but maybe 65%. That's significant growth for renewables, but it's still a very dominant hydrocarbon world.
Yeah, I want to run through the panel so we get a position on that. From your perspective, is it conceivable that we could have such a breakthrough technology or such a sense of environmental urgency that fossil fuels would no longer be a significant part of the mix in 2050?
I think the flavour I would like to add to that answer is if you look at the global energy demand in 2050, and particularly there's going to be a huge demand by emergent economies. And as I mentioned, those emergent economies have got the ability to surprise. The example I quote frequently is the adoption of the cellular telephone worldwide. Simply, certain countries have just bypassed technologies because they're unimpeded. So I think, in broad terms, I have no basis to challenge Richard's numbers. My sense is there may be a basis for some real surprise here.
Mm-hmm. Turkey, do you see room for surprise? I mean, that's of course sort of a loaded question, because there's always room for surprise by definition. But from your perspective, what do you foresee?
I believe that we are always trying to find something to replace these fuels, but I believe that we are going to live with them for a long period of time, because the change in any new technology that is developed is not going to come into the picture immediately. Just even right now, when we discover a new field, maybe you've heard on the TV, in the newspapers you read, Brazil discovered huge reservoirs, and then may contain, these are very soft numbers, 100 billion barrels of oil. But for that field to become alive and then to produce and to contribute to the energy budget of the world, it will take another 10 or 15, 20 years. So I think all of the projections in my mind, the numbers that I have seen, as it was indicated, right now, in the energy mix, we 80 to 85% of our consumption is coming from the fossil resources. And in the year 2020, for example, we believe that that is going to even increase slightly, but it's not going to decrease. So therefore, I think we are going to be together with the fossil energy resources for some more time.
Anthony, would you go along with that?
Yeah, I think Richard's point is well taken. If you look at any projection, whether for our country from EIA or for international projections, IEA, they seem to indicate a significant role for fossil energy, at least until the year 2030 and beyond, and certainly it seems reasonable. But I think we also have to take into account that energy plays a significant part in our lifestyle. As we consider the lifestyle we're capable of leading, energy is a key issue that underpins most of what we're about. And so as we start thinking about the replacement of fossil energy with any other energy source, fossil energy has served us well. It's provided a very stable energy source and allowed us to have a lot of stability and make the kind of projections that Richard was talking about. So I can't project. I mean, I certainly am not going to sit here and say it's impossible or there's any issue that can't be done. But I will say that we need to have that sure, stable supply because it really allows us to have the quality of life and the lifestyle that we enjoy.
Well, actually, I want to follow up with a second question for you because I think from the outside, from many people's perspectives, the issue is not necessarily whether fossil fuels will still be available 40 years from now. It's whether it would still be desirable to be using them, whether it's environmentally sustainable rather than whether we could actually whether we can find new fields, whether we can find sort of new ways to use existing resources. I know you're involved with carbon capture, which is obviously one of the big technologies under discussion right now. When people talk about the future of fossil fuels, they're talking very much about the future of carbon and carbon emissions. Can you talk a little bit about what is carbon capture? How could that work, and could that actually could that make a significant progress in addressing the environmental part of the equation?
Well, let me just take us back a few years and talk about an initiative that some of us may remember, and that was the acid rain problem. I mean, there was a point when fossil energy was considered to be difficult because of acid rain emissions, and there was a large-scale program, a large-scale effort that was deployed, and by and large, we were able to actually reduce acid rain emissions significantly while growing the amount of fossil energy that we utilize. So, in fact, as we started taking on this incredibly important problem and started to deploy technologies, we were able to deploy technologies that were economically palatable and sustainable within our economy, and essentially, in many regards, solve that type of problem. The same type of problem faces us with carbon emissions. And the question is, do we have the technologies to address the problem? At this point in time, there are technologies and well-known technologies that are capable of being deployed. The issue is they're relatively expensive. And so the notion of capturing carbon, there are technologies like sorbents and solvents that actually in some regards are commercially deployable, but would create an energy penalty against the technology, but rather significant, and result in higher costs.
When you say significant, you say significant penalty and significant cost. I mean,
just
ballpark, what are we talking about?
Decrease in efficiency and cost increases on the order of about 50% in some cases. But there are research in place now, and the research in place is against attacking that specific problem, developing new types of sorbents, metal-organic frameworks, and other types of sorbents that have the potential to reduce that cost significantly.
These are materials that would actually pull carbon out of
the stream. Yeah, and essentially, if you were to look at a flue gas stream or some other stream, that would be a stream that would contain carbon dioxide. You would contact against a material, and that carbon dioxide would absorb onto that material, be captured, and then be regenerated in a separate reactor or some separate system and be allowed to be compressed and stored underground. So those technologies are in place, and we have some ideas of how those technologies would be deployed. In fact, we have a large-scale demonstration program that's ongoing right now about demonstrating each aspect of that technology and the deployability of those technologies.
Yeah, that's something I think if we have time, I'd like to come back to a little bit. But Terje, that sort of, it touches right on your point about technological transitions. Even we're not even talking about a radical thing of getting rid of fossil fuels entirely. We're talking about sort of a more incremental thing of keeping our coal-fired plants, for instance, but adding a technology that pulls out the carbon so that you can bury it or pump it underground. that's still a fairly significant technological transition. Is that something that's going to take decades to implement? And what is it?
Well, I think the first part of your question takes me back to 40 years ago. And when I was in the college, I think one of the very first things that we started to worry, well, we had only, this is like mid-60s, we had only 15 more years with the fossil fuel. So here we are 40 years later, we are still saying that we have a certain amount of time and we do not know exactly. Now, and in the meantime, what happened? The technology came into the picture. I mean, just 20, 30 years ago, we didn't know anything about horizontal wells. Now we are able to drill horizontal wells and then increase the recovery. And now, again, on the seismic exploration side of it, again, with three-dimensional seismic exploration techniques, now we are more or less able to see what we have even under the salt layer. You hear probably in these days a lot sub-salt formations. We couldn't see them before. It was like looking into a mirror and then getting a reflection. You couldn't see anything. But right now, we are beyond that. So therefore, the technology has prepared us to look for the much more complex, much more difficult systems, and also the technology enabled us to produce them. Now, when I say all these things, I do not mean that we should really simply rest on our oars and wait for another 100 years. Of course, at the same time, we have to work on the carbon sequestration part of the equation. We have to work on the new technologies. I think all of these things need to be developed at the same time, simultaneously. At the same time, we also have to make sure that we do not run out of the rope while we are coming down. So therefore, we have to make sure that we can still discover some much more challenging reservoirs, and we have to run in a number of different areas, tracks at the same time. And I think right now the scientific and the knowledge and the information that we have accumulated over the course of years will enable us to do so. Therefore, we have to work on each of these areas at the same time in a very rapid and in a very efficient manner.
But if I could just interject,
sure.
The answer is not decades. I mean, the Department of Energy has a program, and its goals are to have deployable technologies as soon as the year 2020. So the answer is not decades, certainly. The answer is much sooner than that to have these types of technologies available.
Okay.
And available, can I jump in?
Yeah, no,
so
I was actually going to
available is
you have an interesting perspective because you have sort of your feet in both camps. You've been at Shell, you've been at MIT.
And available is a great word because the technologies are largely available, and there are programs ongoing, both government-sponsored and with company participation and at universities to prove that these technologies are viable. And it's just, how long will it take? I'm not trying to be negative about it. It just will take some time. But that's good. I mean, and as time goes on, these things get better. Right now, wind power in the United States provides 1.5%, not quite 2% of the electricity generated in the United States. A few years ago, it was a fraction of a percent. By 2020, it might be as much as 5%. That's huge, huge growth. And it's because technologies, many kinds of technologies have been proven up and are available and are being deployed. Same will be true with carbon capture and sequestration. And it really gets to the importance of things like carbon capture, any of these technologies. You asked the question about, is it desirable to be using fossil fuels still? Mm-hmm. I think an answer is, well, yeah, for a lot of reasons. If you ask a chemist to design the perfect fuel, most of them would probably say, sure, give me a few carbons strung together and a backbone with hydrogens around the outside and package it in a convenient liquid I can carry it around, and it would come out looking a lot like gasoline and diesel. And the energy density that we have in the liquid fuels that we use today, gasoline and diesel, is huge. If I have a gallon of gasoline here, there's maybe 10 to 100 times more energy in that gallon of gasoline than in equivalent volume or weight of batteries that I could build today. So this is why we use these fuels. So it will be desirable because they're very efficiently dense fuels. But it will also be desirable to manage the environmental impact of producing these fuels. So states are developing low-carbon fuel standards. And what we're going to see by 2050, certainly, is a greater mix of a biofuel component into these fuel streams. So it's not all coming from the ground in hydrocarbons. Some of it is coming from grasses or municipal waste or other products, biologically derived and then blended in. So it could be that we're burning as much or more gasoline than we are today, but the net environmental impact is going to be much less because of the source of that fuel.
So just to clarify, I mean, in the numbers you were throwing out earlier, in your projection of sort of how much of our energy supply is going to be coming from fossil fuels, were you rolling in biofuels, biodiesel? Is that kind of rolled into that number?
When Shell did the scenario work, and this data is available on the Shell website, it's all for everybody to see. And it's a really good read because it is a good look at how the future might play out. Scenarios are not predictions.
Right.
They're just stories about how the future might play out. And they've taken, when they built these scenarios, they took some pretty big steps in terms of the impact of technology to build new fuel streams into the mix and separate us from Earth-derived fossil fuels. So yes, it does take that into account. One of the things, by the way, that, again, we can't predict, but there are a lot of people, you talked about the energy and what it does for lifestyles. There are a couple of billion other people in the world that look at this lifestyle and say, gee, that would be nice. Whether it's automobiles or heat or whatever. And so the other part of any look to the future suggests significant growth in that overall demand for energy. By 2050, maybe twice the overall demand for energy that there is today. Yes. So that now when I say 65% of a pie that's twice as big, that is a huge slice of energy that's going to be provided by renewables and alternative energies.
Now, I want to follow up on one thing that you mentioned, and then we're going to sort of get off the supply side for a moment. You mentioned, like the state low carbon fuel standards. Obviously, that's just one of many regulatory prods that are changing the landscape. You have an interesting perspective because you've been working on the academic side. You've also been working on the commercial side. On the commercial side, I would assume there are some very, very pragmatic reasons to stick as much as possible to what you know right now, because that's where you can make a profit, and that's where you're dealing with a sort of a known business rather than an unknown business model. At the same time, how much do the governments and do policy groups need to push to change that equation in order for the business to sort of know what the landscape is that they're adapting to?
Yeah, quite a lot. And so Shell does scenarios not for the fun of it. Shell does scenarios because they allow the company to look at the future and how it might play out and what the business needs to do to respond to a variety of potential futures. And part of the scenario work is looking at really, there are three things at work in the business of energy right now that are impacting things globally. One is there are plenty of molecules out there, and we could go on and on about that. There are plenty of molecules out there. That's not the issue. The issue is that they are the rates that we are using them, as I talked about earlier, is growing. It's getting harder and harder to supply all of those molecules to customers around the world at those rates. And when we're extracting them from the earth, where we are getting them is in tougher places, more environmentally sensitive, deeper formations, deeper water, tighter rocks, whatever. So it's getting harder to get the energy out of the earth. It's getting harder and harder to move it around in large quantities, and we're becoming more aware of the environmental consequences. So companies, and Shell as one, are looking at that, saying, so what is the right approach? And yes, we could just hunker down and do what we do best, and that might be fine for the next couple of years, but it doesn't set up the company to be prosperous 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now, continuing to supply energy to people. And so companies, and I think all companies take different views of this. Some are much more conservative some not. Some say we want to be a part of that future. Some say we'll react to that future.
Where would you put Shell in that?
Shell,
just to put you on the spot.
No, Shell's view is wanting to help create that future by pushing technology in the right directions, but pushing technology in a landscape of knowns, known regulatory environment, known legislative environment, known fiscal environments. Now, some of that we can't control. Nobody knows what the price of oil is going to be tomorrow, much less in 2050, so we'll take that off the table. But it would be very nice if there were sound global scale regulatory and legislative efforts to push low carbon fuel standards, to push carbon capture and sequestration, to push environmentally sound, sensible alternatives, and that would help pull companies into that marketplace. And that's how Shell behaves and believes is the right way forward.
Yeah, I want to switch directions a little bit because we've been focused so much on the supply side, but there's also the demand side, which obviously has a big impact, and that's something, Paul, I know you've been involved in. Discover and the National Science Foundation have done a series of presentations on Capitol Hill recently, and one of them really focused on energy efficiency. And an interesting theme that came out was two of the speakers talked about that energy efficiency, think about energy efficiency as a fuel rather than thinking of it as sort of a negative thing of what you're not doing. Think of it as an active thing. You're, in a sense, generating new supply by what you're not using. And I know you've been involved with some of that kind of thinking and developing. Can you talk about sort of where does efficiency play into the role of things? Can efficiency actually can that significantly change this landscape?
Yes, it can. As a very short answer, let me try and amplify upon that. The last discussion was, for me, extremely interesting. My personal view is that emissions are going to become the dominant agenda item. It won't be availability. Within the emissions, we've talked about carbon sequestration. Again, if I look at that from a systematic point of view, that's a sink. What can I do to reduce my source? Efficiency in reducing source has got a huge place to play. Let me try and give you some examples. If I look at UK data, 80% of the carbon emission can be attributable to either heating or electricity generation, and clearly there is an element of overlap there. There's a number of ways that the impact of that 80% can be reduced. Let me try and give you some examples. Right now in the UK, I can't sell my home unless I actually produce an energy efficiency pack. Right now in Italy, I can receive tax incentives to go and buy very high efficiency appliances for my home. If I look forward into the technology arena, and I believe this is a very, very short step away now, looking at how humans interact with their environments and driving energy efficiency as a consequence of that interaction in a very seamless manner is very, very realizable. The underpinning technologies already exist. Building in intelligence into systems already exists. Communications already exist. What could that achieve? Potentially a 25% reduction. And
25% reduction in the total energy demand?
That's correct.
And it's sort of at a personal level, a domestic level. What would that mean for the way people live? What would change in your home, or what would change in your lifestyle?
What's actually really important in this is not to actually create a visible change. It's actually, this is about making the technology transparent. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example. One of the things I actually find frustrating walking around with my iPhone, sorry, I like cellular phones as an example, is when I've perpetually got to reconnect it onto a network. That just irritates me beyond belief. However, if I walk into an environment and it recognises I've been there and automatically reconnects onto the Wi-Fi for me, that works well. Right. That's technology working to my advantage. The same is actually true of appliances. It's relatively simple. When you're preparing your lunch in the microwave oven for 90 seconds, get the microwave oven to talk to the rest of the domestic system and pull down demand and stop demand to other appliances. That is very realisable, and that's an area that we are looking to demonstrate here on campus.
So you don't get peaks in your energy usage.
So you're actually managing your energy usage quite efficiently. The other aspect of this, which is again from as a non-academic saying this, but from an academic point of view, there's a whole new family of systems engineering, cognition-centric systems engineering, which we think is really going to empower these changes.
And one of the most visible places that people interact with fossil fuels, obviously, is in transportation. I mean, I think for a lot of people, fossil fuels means oil, and oil means pumping gasoline into your car. It's the most obvious place that we interact with it in our lives. Right now, there's we were talking about this a little bit before this panel began. I mean, there's a tiny, tiny sliver of the market of cars that do not, in some sense, use gasoline. I mean, even diesels are a minimal fraction of the share here in the United States. Hybrids use less gasoline, but they're still gasoline powered. We're looking at a very small number of battery-powered vehicles, compressed natural gas-powered vehicles, close to zero, but some hydrogen-powered vehicles on the road. What about that? Is that a growth area? I mean, certainly all the manufacturers right now are talking about battery-powered cars as a way to at least take the gasoline immediately out of the car and give you more options of where your electricity comes from. But is that something that could put a significant dent?
When you look at emission, and the reason I actually went for sort of heat and power generation is that is actually the dominant source. But clearly any impact from transportation will be equally beneficial. My personal view on electric and hybrid electric cars is that I will sit down and I will do some relatively simple math, and I will work out very crudely what is my return on investment. If I go out and buy a well-known, specifically designed hybrid car, the number in the UK is about 17 years return on investment. I'm very sorry, that doesn't make sense to me. How can I make better sense of that return on investment is if I actually began to integrate that car into the domestic power. Simply, I drive home on a night, I arrive at, if I'm lucky, at 5, if I'm unlucky, 7, 8, 9 in the evening. I plug it into my domestic system. I drive my domestic system at peak demand from that car. Then, whilst I've got access to cheap electricity, I recharge the car in the early hours of the morning. Then I can begin to tell quite a different economic story. So rather than just buying a car to make a statement, I'm beginning to see some pretty favourable returns, and it plays well into that part of the market.
Does that sound like a plausible technological transition? Anthony, I saw you nodding.
I think where he's moving towards is the more efficient use of off-peak electricity. As we start talking about managing the demand side, we have to understand that we put a lot of strain on our electricity demand by our use of it. So things like smart grid and also some of these other considerations, perhaps off-peak powering of vehicles, gives us an opportunity to maybe stabilize more our power plants, how they interact with the demand side, and perhaps achieve higher efficiencies on the power production. At that point in time, when you increase the efficiency, going back to some of Richard's numbers, increasing the efficiency with which we use fossil energy will have a significant impact because it's such a significant component or fraction of our power suite.
Can we circle back for a second? Because smart grid is a term that I think gets thrown around a lot, and I'm not sure how many people actually know what a smart grid means. Can you just sort of break down sort of what that technology would do and how it helps with efficiency?
As you start talking about smart grid, what you're talking about is having a supply and demand more interactive. I think you heard some of the comments being made of the sense of trying to reduce some of the peak demands on the power cycle. These peak demands create quite a challenge for the power generation. ways of smoothing out those peaks can have the opportunity for running more efficiently. Smart grid is one of the options that allows us to do that. It allows an interaction between the supply and demand so that you can smooth out some of these issues, allow people to maybe have access to off-peak electrons that may be cheaper and maybe cheaper on their side, but also help the grid to run more efficiently.
And there are some real technologies that will enable smart grid adoption more widely. One would be storage, energy storage. Mm-hmm. One of the great things about having a smart grid, doing things like Paul talked about, being able to charge the electric vehicles at night when electricity is cheap. It's cheap because, if it were priced that way, because there's a lot of generating capacity that's just spinning all night long, because you can't shut down a big coal-fired power plant at 9 o'clock at night and fire it up at 6 in the morning and run it efficiently. So they just spin all night long, pushing electricity into the grid, which has very little home, and it just gets dissipated in the grid because there's no use for it. So if you could store that electricity, and this is where huge big battery technologies are being thought. There's work at MIT building batteries the size of this auditorium to store huge amounts of power late at night to be dumped back into the grid first thing in the morning when everybody's getting up and turning on the lights and turning on the blenders and turning on everything else. This is the kind of stuff that enables the smart grid to happen. At the same time, there's a lot of very mundane technologies, like your right foot on the gas and brake pedal as you drive. And it's been shown repeatedly that you can mind your right foot a little bit better and save 10 or 20% on fuel economy. Most any driver in most any vehicle. So there's this mix of things, from very high tech, big tech, small tech, to pretty low tech.
I mean, energy storage is obviously a whole other very interesting area, because energy storage relates not just to using the current grid in a more intelligent way. It also opens up the options using renewable sources, to using wind and solar, things, intermittent fuel sources, energy sources that right now are very hard to use because the grid doesn't handle that kind of uneven load very well. I'm Turgay, is that coming back to this idea of technological transition, the difficulty of getting from here to there, is building a storage infrastructure? You see that as one of the important transitional technologies?
Well, I think there are certain things that can be stored, and I think there are certain things that we cannot really store. Sometimes we hear that, well, maybe we should really open our strategic reserves. I mean, there is maybe some kind of a misinformation. I think how much we can store along those lines and in that area, I think that's not going to work. And I also, before I come back to your question, I want to indicate something. I think, if I not misunderstand, it was indicated that if we could decrease the energy demand by 25%, to me, I think it's a kind of an uphill battle. I think rather than working on that issue, and because I believe that I don't think that we can get there, maybe with the efficiency we can cover some distance along those lines, but I believe that we should try to focus on what are the technologies that we need to reduce the carbon emission, for example. Now, if you look at the history, in my mind, humanity started to burn. When they started, they were using wood to generate energy. Then they switched to coal, and then we switched to oil. Each time when we make these moves, the number of carbon atoms that we are burning is decreasing. Now we are getting ready to use natural gas much more effectively. So I believe that this century is going to be the year for natural gas. Now, we can store natural gas more effectively than oil. We cannot store oil. And in all these things, when they come together at the end, they are going to show that the oil industry, natural gas industry, has a very inelastic structure. A small demand or a small increase in the demand or a small decrease in the demand or in the supply, on the supply side, they create very large effects on the price structure simply because we cannot store them. If you have produced oil, then you have to go and you have to distribute to the system and then get it used. So therefore, I believe that in terms of storage, I think we can do something with natural gas. We can do something with even compressed air, and then change it to energy. But I believe that with oil, it's almost impossible.
Right, so you're really talking about sort of two different concepts of storage. I mean, the electricity storage, the kind of storage you build into the grid, and actual storage as reserves of fossil fuels that would help even out supply. I mean, that did make me wonder. I mean, we're sort of talking about fossil fuels as if it's one thing, but of course, we're talking about coal, we're talking about oil, we're talking about natural gas, we're talking about a number of different things. I mean, to some extent, you know, is part of what we need to do to actually kind of manage the mix. I mean, coal is something that's mostly plugged into our electricity infrastructure. Oil is something that's mostly plugged into our transportation infrastructure. Do we need to start actually splitting those apart and dealing with them separately?
Yeah. May I make a comment
Absolutely.
on that? I believe that when we look at the power stations here, the base feed for the power stations in the U.S., it's coal. So whenever there's a peak, for peak shaving purposes, then the natural gas comes into the picture. So one of the things, probably, just going back towards reducing the carbon emission, maybe try to change them in such a way that the base feed can be natural gas, and then for the peak shaving purposes, maybe we can use coal. So therefore, when we change their roles in that energy equation, I think that is going to help in terms of reducing carbon emission.
Is it Richard?
And that's actually a really good point, and it's a whole change of mentality. People have looked at the design of big coal plants as these just big coal plants. You just start them up and you run them flat out, and you run them forever, and you run them as efficiently as you can. But there are designs for coal plants that can start and stop in a matter of moments. That can be the peak shavers, and the advantage of switching from coal to, say, greater amounts of natural gas as the base load. On an energy equivalent basis, the CO2 emissions are about half for natural gas powered electricity generation versus coal powered electricity generation. So there's a huge gain right there in terms of potential climate and environmental impacts.
Right, but then how far can the natural gas reserves take us in terms of supply?
Quite a way. There's actually a lot of natural gas in the world. Now the question comes back to deliverability, and it would mean expanding natural gas distribution systems and pipelines. But again, this is not rocket science. This is pretty straightforward technology. There are significant pipeline networks all around this country right now. And the right-of-ways exist, and more pipelines could be built, and that infrastructure could be expanded. Natural gas plays a big role in the United States, and in Western Europe, much less so in the rest of the world. And there's scope for building more natural gas power generation elsewhere in the world. But again, that's a new infrastructure that needs to be built to move natural gas, a little more complex than digging up coal and putting it in rail cars and driving it across the landscape. But it's all very doable. And it has huge benefits in terms of environmental impacts.
I want to open up the conversation to a slightly larger scale in a couple of ways. One is that I think, there's a certain tendency to think of America as the world, at least when we're talking to an American audience. But there are at least a couple of you have alluded to the fact that we're looking at fossil fuel demand on a global basis, and that what we do here is really only a small part of the picture, and actually a shrinking part of the total picture. Which, I mean, to me, to some extent, comes back to the question of energy efficiency. That where there are other parts of the world that see our standard of living, that want our standard of living, that quite reasonably expect our standard of living. It seems like to me we need to come at that from both sides. We need to figure out how to generate the power that they need in order to have that in a more sustainable way. But also, if they're coming to our standard of living from a perspective of radically higher efficiency, that is going to really change a lot of the equation. I mean, is that a direction we should be actively pursuing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is exactly it, in my opinion. That sort of we have emergent economies, we have a global economy, We need to find a way to sort of deliver energy into those economies. I do believe there's an opportunity for sort of, as I mentioned earlier, for surprise within those areas, technological surprise. If you can combine that with net efficiency savings, yes. But the question I ask is, if we were sat here at 2050, looking at the net effect of that, would we be satisfied? Would we be satisfied that the 2/3 of the energy into those economies are coming from significantly more efficient sources with significantly smaller carbon footprints, and they're much more efficient at using it? They've bypassed us.
I think there's a neat thought here, and it's efficiency is a great concept. There's nothing wrong with thinking about efficiency, but I think it's also important to think about utility. What's important in energy, if we think about it's energy that drives the quality of life. It's energy that purifies water, that moves people around, that moves information around. It's not the molecules. It's not the carbon and hydrogen, it's the energy itself. And if we think about the utility, it gets back to the point that Paul made at the very beginning about telephones. You know, it used to be that telephones was about putting a black phone in everybody's house and stringing them together with wire. And now, no, it's about connecting people. The utility is not the box. The utility is that connection. And now I'm off to, I don't know where this is going to go. But when you then opened up the conversation thinking about revolutions and just dramatic changes in technology, I think these are the kind of dramatic changes that will come down. I don't know what they're going to look like, but somewhere there's going to be a redefinition of the utility of energy away from the molecules and to the uses. And we'll find whole new ways of delivering the energy from source to user, and that's where the revolutions really will take place. It won't look anything like what we're doing today.
Well, I mean, let's say, I mean, taking a sort of a high end of the possible scenarios, let's say that it reaches the point where the problem of global warming is recognized to be so serious that we need to do a serious cut in global carbon emissions. We're talking, we actually, say go 50% below where we are right now, which would be obviously be a radical change. How could we do that? I mean, and could we do that with the kind of technology that we have right now?
In what time frame? By 2050?
Let's say by 2050. 2050 emissions could be 50% level, 50% below where we are now.
I think it's possible. What you have to do is aggressively pursue some of the work on carbon capture and sequestration. There's a lot of high technology work there on capture technologies, on catalysts. There's a lot of then pretty low-tech work on building a new infrastructure to take all of that carbon dioxide and move it to the sequestration sites. Because you're talking now about a volume of carbon dioxide that's roughly equivalent to the amount of oil and gas we move around this country. Right. But it's all very doable. We can do that. There's nothing to stop that from happening. And its footprint on the surface won't be huge. It won't change the standard of living. Ultimately, the cost of power probably won't go up very much. We saw that with the sulfur capture. It didn't raise the cost of power very much. It is all very doable, but it's you have to start somewhere. You have to start now with something that doesn't look quite right. The hybrids that are available today, they don't look quite right if you're doing the cost-benefit analysis. But until we start building them and driving them and learning how to build better hybrids, we're not going to build better hybrids. Until we start doing carbon capture and sequestration and experimenting with new catalysts and new technologies, that's when we're going to learn to do it better.
Yeah, I think the history of technology deployment of that nature has always shown that there's a learning curve, and sometimes that learning curve can be years. As we look historically at some of the learning curves we've seen with desulfurization technologies and others, it's been as much as 20 years. Now, I think we don't want to afford that. I mean, whether we can afford it or not, I don't think we want to afford that learning curve. So we need to employ better methods of getting down that learning curve more rapidly. But there's a second point that you brought up that I think we have to understand. It's really a portfolio of solutions. I think the notion of looking for one silver bullet is kind of mislaid. I mean, it's really a portfolio of solutions. Smart grid's going to be part of the answer. Energy storage and better ways of taking advantage of energy opportunities are part of the answer. Renewables are certainly going to be part of the answer. Carbon capture and storage are part of the answer. I think what we have to look at is we're going to have a suite of opportunities available to us and pick and choose what opportunity makes sense for the problem set at hand. As we look internationally, it's certainly China is going developing quite a lot of carbon-based technology and carbon-based power generation today. It's really in our best interest for them to use the most efficient technologies, as well as to start deploying carbon capture and storage. So as we start our demonstration program in this country and start developing a notion of how we're doing carbon capture and storage, how we're integrating those technologies together, as Richard said, and moving the CO2, I think other countries will see that and take advantage of those technologies, and it's in our best interest because as they reduce CO2 emissions, it's a global problem, not a singular national problem.
And let me tell you how significant these learning curves can be from my own experience. Real live data from the past as opposed to the easier projections into the future. When Shell built its first deep water facility in the Gulf of Mexico, producing oil and gas from 3,000 feet water depth in the Gulf of Mexico, we built it as best as we knew how at the time. We put it out in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a success commercially. It was a success technologically. It started production in 1993. It's still producing today, I think, at rates higher than what we had originally planned because it worked out so well from a technological standpoint. That was in 1993. By 2003, we had built a series of these structures in the Gulf of Mexico, known technology, extensions into a new environment, into new applications, and in 10 years we took 2/3 out of the cost. We did it as good as we could in 1993, but in 2003 we were doing it for 1/3 the money because we had done it several times. We really knew how to do it better. But, knew what better meant.
But returning to this idea of the portfolio, obviously, one possibility we're leaving here is that that portfolio might open up through some radical new technology. That we might, that nuclear fusion, we might actually achieve a way to do commercially viable nuclear fusion, or really cheap solar hydrogen, or maybe something that's not actually on the on our horizon right now. That's traditionally that's been where the government steps in, because those are things, they're sort of wild card bets, and it's sort of an unfair question to ask, since projections are and predictions like that are sort of impossible to know. But like, how much should we be sort of putting down bets on the wild card technologies, on the possibility that they might add to the mix and really change that mix? I mean, how important is it? Let me start with you, since you're actually sort of here with it.
Yeah, I think I'd hesitate to really to go into depth on that question, because I think we're seeing that the government has taken that shot. If you look at the breakdown of the Department of Energy's budget, you're seeing how they're looking at that portfolio, allocating certain funds for and making a big play.
It's carbon capture
and storage, to make a big understanding for developing deployable technology, while at the same time have a significant budget related to photovoltaic developments and other types of renewables. I don't know what the right number should be. I mean, I think that's just crystal ball. I think the federal government's budget really is trying to take a reasoned approach and saying, okay, what is the right type of investment across the board? And you're right, some of these really require government investment to reduce the risk of those types of technology and move them forward more rapidly.
Well, Turgay, I mean, you think about a lot about kind of like technological change. Obviously, we're always making our bets. A lot of small bets on incremental stuff, and then you put the occasional bet on something big. How important is it to put the bets on sort of the sort of high frontier but potentially high payoff types of things? Your solar power satellites in space. Some of these exotic things that people talk about.
I think revolutionary developments or ideas, in my mind, they do not really happen overnight. It'll take some time. And I think any incremental development on solar energy, on wind. I think we were talking about in the US, we said that wind power is about 1.52% of our total energy. And if you go to Denmark, I think it is close to 50%. What they are using over there. So I think, again, it's very difficult for me as an academician, as a scientist, just to say that, well, this is going to be the winner. Because I don't think that there can be only one winner in this, in this approach. I think we have to look all of these possibilities, and from nuclear energy to hydroelectric power to solar energy, we have to bring them, all of them, and then make sure that they take their places in this overall energy budget of the world, and then they are used accordingly. So therefore, it's very difficult for me just to say that this will be the winners.
And Paul, do you have any thoughts on this? And then I want to throw it up into questions from the audience.
I think, well, firstly, giving you a very glib answer, if I knew where the wild card was, I certainly wouldn't share it with you because I'd be investing in their stock. But a less glib answer is, fundamentally, I believe in portfolios. I am systematic, as I've described, and there's got to be a balance of incremental, relatively small improvements, and yet there's got to be sort of continued investment and appetite in higher risk, higher payback opportunities, and those should be pursued. I think fundamentally a portfolio is very, very important.
So after this, I want to find out where you're spending your money, so I can find out what's happening in the future.
No, I don't necessarily want to call them wild cards because it suggests, oh, geez, we got to get lucky, or it's all going to crater, and I don't believe that. But I do like the description of them as higher risk, high potential opportunities of novel technologies, of really new and innovative ideas, and I think that is. There's a huge potential benefit out there for novel ideas, new thinking, different kind of high-risk, high-reward ventures. And the difference between pursuing those and not, I think is actually very significant. If everybody just sort of hunkers down and said, everybody being countries around the world, hunkers down and says, look, it's just too hard. And I'm just going to make sure as a country that my number one priority is energy security. I'm going to lock up this and I'm going to lock up that. And I'll build what I can for solar and wind, but I'm going to go to Africa and buy these resources, and I'm going to go to Australia and get a supply.
Which certainly is happening.
It is. If everybody just does that, what happens? 50 years from now, we probably squeak by. It's messy, it's ugly, it's kind of maybe borderline conflict-ridden, but we probably squeak by because there are a lot of molecules out there and there's plenty of sun hitting the earth and everything else. But it's messy and ugly. That's a very different world than a world where it's a bit more thoughtful, with a bit more investment into some longer range technologies and novel ideas. And that world is not just squeaking by. That's a world of abundant energy, of very efficient use of energy, probably much greater energy demand overall than the just squeaking by world, but with an enormously greater supply because of the ideas and the technology that's been put to work on it. That's how I think the world plays out when you invest in ideas. And I think there's plenty of evidence from the past to suggest that can happen, probably will happen with energy.
But I think there's an important aspect which needs to be clarified on that, which is actually never underestimate the amount of time to take a very promising, high-risk, high-payback idea and turn it into reality where it's making substantial impact. You know, that time constant, in my experience, is measured. I think the quickest I've seen it is 7 years. More realistically, I would use 10 years as a benchmark.
Look at nuclear fusion, which is, we don't even know how many years that is. It's 40-some years and counting.
They say 50, and we really mean it this time.
Yeah. But I do want to open things up to questions from the audience. We have a microphone over here. You'll probably appear, we're videotaping this, and so you'll probably appear on camera. I just wanted to let you know, so if you want to fix your hair or do anything dramatic, now's the time to do it. So do we have any questions from the audience?
I think technological surprise may be here already. One is in wave power. where there are some test results that indicate a 20 square mile area of ocean could power all of California. Another one is using geothermal energy in a different way. There is a new invention that was just announced where we can use 165-degree temperature, raise water to 165 degrees and generate real power. And we can do that by opening up closed oil wells and sending water down those wells and sending water down wells that are about to be closed, that are all over the world, and certainly many of them in the United States. Another one is we could certainly build 100 fission plants, atomic reactors in the United States in the next 10 years if we could settle on one safe design. And I'm wondering how you feel about those developments.
It's a great question. Anybody here want to tackle that? Richard, you want to start?
So I don't know about the numbers on wave power, but there's real potential on wave power. I was in one of Stephen's labs today looking at some of the work that's being done here on novel applications for wave power, and it's pretty interesting. And who knows? And I think there will be surprises in things like that. Geothermal is a huge area. The energy inside the Earth is enormous. It's just very widely dispersed. But there are ways to get that energy and bring it to the surface and use it. Nuclear fission, sure. That's just one of the problems. But there's plenty of, it's like everything else. There's plenty of nuclear fuel around. We know how to build plants. It's a question of societal will and political will to solve a big energy problem with a component looking like nuclear.
Did you want to chime in on that? Or?
Yeah, personally, from a nuclear point of view, yes. My politics align with that. I think that is there's an inevitability that there will be a renewed nuclear program. One of the things that sort of I have some pretty serious concerns, grave concerns over, is the availability of skilled resource to actually design safe and efficient plants. And that resource has been dissipated pretty heavily. So I've got some concerns there. Wave power, which you mentioned, wave power is actually extremely interesting in terms of accessible wave energy. And there are clearly locations which are better suited than others. Part of the technology we're working on here is looking to sort of address those limitations. But I think if you look at the required level of scale up from where we are now, and we're running proof of concept systems in tanks at scale model level. And normally when I talk about technological development, I talk about the valley of death, where you've actually got to sort of put some pretty serious investment in to mature technology to a point where it's useful. And that links into the time scale. I think wave power potentially has got two valleys of death. One is actually taking it from the scale it's at now, to demonstrating on a meaningful level. And then the second valley of death is actually taking that meaningful demonstration and actually producing it in a manner which is suitable for robust and reliable operation in quite an arduous environment.
Okay, we have another question here. I want to make sure we have time.
Joe Matola from Stevens Institute of Technology, and I want to thank you all for being here, Shell and Discover. My question has to do with cap and trade and the things that are going on the Hill that are getting into the public eye regarding tax incentives and trying to establish some numbers and some things like can you sell your house if it's not energy efficient, that sort of thing. I'm wondering to what degree this has really been informed by technology and by the research and communities that you all represent, and kind of where you all think this might be headed.
Well, I mean, Anthony, do you want to weigh on that a little bit from the sequestration side? And
yeah, we are developing the technologies that allow reasoned consideration to be made. I think carbon capture and storage is one of those technologies. Going back to the first question, There's a number of technologies, and the answer is portfolio. I'm certainly not going to weigh in on the political debate because that's not my area of expertise, but I think the answer is going to be lying in the fact that we're going to develop a lot of different technological solutions, and as we stated several times during this discussion, we're going to match solution with opportunity.
Okay.
And on the policy side, let me just jump in from a company perspective, a Shell perspective. Shell is a great company, and that a principle that sort of runs through the company is we don't make this world, we just have to live in it. And we don't set policy as a company. But our job as a company is to provide energy to people in this. And cap and trade is a great one where things start to interact. And the way to look at that, and the way Shell looks at it, is what are you trying to do? You're trying to limit the amount of carbon dioxide that gets up into the atmosphere. You're trying to spur technology and a development of carbon storage systems, whatever they might look like. And so Shell as a company supports cap and trade as broadly as possible. Frankly, would rather see it as a global system rather than a series of little local systems, right, but supports it because the cap actually limits the amount of carbon dioxide that's allowed up into the atmosphere, and the trade part is a very strong economic signal that drives innovation and drives the market to bring the best solutions forward.
So you feel the types of cap and trade that are on the table right now, you think this is a move in the right direction?
In general, it's again, not commenting on specific legislation, but the idea that there is a very broad cap and trade system in place is an idea that Shell as a corporation supports and would like to see implemented.
Okay, you start to.
I think my main concern about cap and trade, I think it's a wonderful idea, but as Richard indicated, if it's not implemented very broadly for the entire world, and then you can do everything here and in another place they send their carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it's everybody's carbon dioxide. So it's not going to, it will be very difficult to enforce, and it will be very difficult to implement throughout the world. So therefore, there is a possibility that where it is implemented, some of the organizations can find themselves in a kind of a disadvantageous situation.
I think we had another question here.
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. I want to follow up along the lines of the discussion I heard earlier about what I'll say is very optimistic pricing or future. But 2050, some of us, maybe it's a naive way to think about it, but if population is going to be growing over the next 50 years substantially, if the demand for energy in emerging markets is going to be growing substantially, you talk about peak energy, we may not be at peak energy, but we may be close by 2050, we may be past peak energy. And you mentioned that very, very small changes in demand could have tremendous changes in economics and in price. Do we not have the formula for a perfect storm in unaffordability? And if you add to that carbon taxation or cap and trade, yet another element in the formula, I see what looks like something very, very bleak for affordability, that household income will be consumed in ever larger percentages in energy, the energy budget, but perhaps not. If you guys can comment.
Yes, it could play out in a really messy, unhappy way. It could also play out in a much more thoughtful, planned way if company, given, let's take, we all seem to agree, we 5 or 4 at least, there are plenty of molecules out there. There's plenty of energy, primary energy source. It's a matter of getting it to market. If that's the case, how do you do that? Well, what companies will look for to provide sure energy supplies into the future is a stable environment. It was said earlier about the time frame. Energy companies operate on energy time. Energy time is not 2 years, it's not 4 years, it's not 6 years. Energy time is measured in decades, right? And the business of energy operates on decades. Oil fields are developed, they will produce for decades. Power plants are built, they will operate for decades. This is the way energy companies operate and want to operate. If the legislative and policy frameworks are predictable and stable. And companies can look out over decades and know that their investments are going to be, sure, technically risky, but from a regulatory and legislative standpoint, safe. Then companies will make those kinds of investments, and those big investments, whether it's in carbon sequestration technology or whether it's in magical new batteries or magnets or whatever, those are the kinds of investments that are going to change the picture. So it's a very good point. And it really plays out to the importance of it's not something that just companies do. It's not something that just governments do. It's something that society as a whole has to do.
So really the time to be thinking about 2050 is
now.
Right about now.
Yeah.
If I could just add a point, I tend to be optimistic. I think we can look at some of these problem sets and kind of consider that there's a very difficult barrier in front of us, or we can look at there's an opportunity for innovation. I think people are starting to recognize that energy is an important issue. I think it's become an area that's attracting some of the young scientists of today, and I know at our lab we're starting to see a larger influx of people very interested in this problem set. That kind of gives me a sense of optimism as we start seeing the attractiveness of this area to people and innovators. I can't help but think that we're going to find available solutions.
I think in terms of specifics, there's one example which interests me personally, which is actually sort of some of the Norwegian hydroelectric. They've got a pricing structure which actually, as the capacity in the reservoirs fall, the price of energy increases. The discussions I've had with sort of Norwegian consumers in that area, there is a level of acceptability that is how their pricing structure works. And if the price rises too high, they start to abate their use. So there are practical examples of where controls are in place. And if the economics are unfavourable, there is a downturn in demand. I think we need to be pragmatic and accept there will be an element of that. And one of the things that sort of, I think it took us, 90 minutes to get to the doomsayer versus Methuselah debate, which I think was pretty impressive.
Yeah, nobody's calling anybody Hitler, so this is a total success. This isn't going to be the end of the discussion, I'm afraid. So, Tricia, would you like to have a final comment?
I think.
Oh, wait. We have time for one more? Okay.
I'd just like the views of the panel on what do you think about global warming? Do you believe it's a threat to our way of life, or it's a hoax?
Okay, you've been presented with a choice.
I will do the safe thing here, and I will the company's view. Shell as a big energy company's view is that if 90% of the world's governments believe it's a problem, it's a problem. It's the environment that we have to live in and work in, and we have to deliver energy against. And so we are going to, given now, yes, okay, so we're an energy company. We deliver carbon-based fuels around the world. Given that reality, we're going to do the best we can to help the world manage its way through this problem. Now, the good news is that if it turns out not to be a problem, we're going to make some pretty interesting discoveries along the way on environmental management, on efficiency, on the use of energy, which I think will play out for the better anyway. So I think it's a safe bet to take for the company to be that way, and that's the way Shell is behaving. Okay, it's a problem. We're going to be part of a solution. Let's work on it. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, if I say yes, there will be a number of my friends will be very happy. If I say no, I think there will be a number of friends who will be very happy also. But when I look at this thing, in my mind, Mother Nature has given us a very, very sensitive environment, a sensitive balance, very delicate balance. And for years and years, carbon dioxide has been emitted and from the swamps, and then went to the atmosphere. And then we did not see its effect. But then it means that any additional, a small increment that is brought, introduced into this system, then disturb that very delicate balance. So what I have difficulty in understanding, though, I mean, some of our friends, academicians, scientists, when they make their calculations, they say, well, what we are coming up with 1 degree centigrade increase over a period of 100 years. And on the other hand, there are also scientists who are very prominent and very, very capable. They are saying that, well, that increases in the range of about 5 degrees centigrade. So therefore, it looks like we are still trying to find out whether it is there, but what is its magnitude? And if we can find out that magnitude, if we can pin it down, then we'll be able to see that whether it is going to be very disturbing for the entire world, or maybe we can try to control it at that level, then we can continue to live on this planet.
And I know this puts you in a sensitive position.
I don't think I have anything to add at this point.
One thing I would like to add on to Richard's point of view, which I thought is an interesting one, which is, the only way we're going to move forward on this issue is if basically we find a consensus way in which you can address the environmental concerns and you can address the sort of the economic and the development concerns. Find a path that actually brings both sides along together. A path of radical carbon cuts that require radical decrease in quality of life or decrease in the size of the economy. Realistically, that's not going to happen. The flip side of it is that we've been talking about a number of technologies here, a number of approaches here that actually could lead to radical carbon cuts without a radical decrease in lifestyle, without radical economic drawbacks. And honestly, that's the only way I can see this thing moving forward. The only way you're going to build the political consensus and the economic consensus and the international consensus to do this is if you find a way to sort of set the goals that meet your environmental needs, and then you find the technologies that meet your economic needs, and you bring those two sides together. And I think one of the reasons I was very happy to have this panel together is I think this is a sort of I hope this would be a kind of anti-polarizing event, because if we're going to move forward, that's the only way I could see it possibly happening. So I thank you all for being here. I thank you all for bringing I think a very thoughtful perspective to this discussion, and I thank the audience. I think Shell and Stevens for being such gracious hosts here.